Today we're diving into an incredibly dark and complex true crime mystery, one that started in a small community but eventually gripped the entire nation. We're unpacking the tragic 35-year cold case of Jonelle Matthews. She was a bright, assertive 12-year-old girl who just vanished without a trace from her home in Greeley, Colorado. We're going to walk through the evidence, the timelines, and some truly shocking twists straight from the case files to try and understand exactly what happened.
To really put the magnitude of this case into perspective, you have to remember what was going on at the time. During the 1970s and 80s, the U.S. was facing a literal epidemic. We're talking over 1 million children going missing every single year. The media frenzy around Jonelle was so intense that in March of 1985, President Ronald Reagan actually pleaded with journalists across the country for help, and he specifically mentioned Jonelle by name. But despite the President of the United States bringing national attention to her disappearance, this case would go unsolved for decades.
Section 1, A Winter Night in 1984. The disappearance of Jonelle Matthews. So, the date is December 20th. Jonelle had just wrapped up a holiday choir concert at her middle school and grabbed a ride home from a friend's dad. By all accounts, everything seemed perfectly normal.
But what makes this case so incredibly chilling is the ultra-tight timeline of events. Look at this. At 8:15 p.m., she's dropped off, walks inside, and flashes the porch lights to let her ride know she's safe indoors. At 8:30 p.m., phone records show she answered the home phone to take a message for her dad, Jim, who was an elementary school principal. But then, at 9:30 p.m., her dad gets home to a completely empty house. In just a 60-minute window, a totally normal, festive evening turned into an absolute nightmare.
When her dad walked into the living room, he found a scene that was basically frozen in time. The space heater was still running right by her favorite spot on the couch, next to the Christmas tree. Her favorite shawl was draped across the back of the couch, like she'd just casually taken it off, and her shoes are perfectly placed right in front of where she'd been sitting. It was this cozy, picturesque holiday scene, except the 12-year-old girl who was just sitting there was gone.
Section 2. The trail goes cold. Decades without answers. The Greeley police were at the house within 15 minutes, and they were immediately stumped. There was zero sign of a struggle, no sign of forced entry. Initially, they actually thought, well, maybe she just ran away. Actually, scratch that. Running away without shoes or a jacket on a freezing cold Colorado night, that just didn't make any sense.
And then they found something outside that completely flipped the investigation. Out in the snow, right around the living room windows, police found large footprints. Way too large to belong to a 12-year-old girl. But here's the truly terrifying part. Someone had taken a rake and carefully tried to erase those tracks. This was the moment police realized someone had been standing out there in the freezing dark, watching Jonelle inside her own home. This was no runaway case, it was an abduction.
Desperate for answers, the police pivoted to a major suspect, but it turned out to be a massive red herring. They spent weeks intensely monitoring Terry Vieira Martinez. This was Jonelle's biological mother, who had placed her for adoption when she was just 13. But the reality? Terry had absolutely zero contact with Jonelle and didn't even know she was missing. Every single lead they chased, friends, neighbors, teachers, it all just hit a brick wall.
35. That is the sheer, devastating weight of the time that passed. For 35 years, Jim and Gloria Matthews lived without knowing what happened to their daughter. A whole decade after she vanished, they had to make the incredibly agonizing choice to declare their bright, smiling little girl legally deceased. They eventually retired down to Costa Rica, holding onto a tiny sliver of hope for closure that felt like it was just never, ever going to come. Section 3, Unearthing the Truth. A random dig changes everything. On July 23, 2019, a routine oil and gas pipeline construction dig fundamentally changed the course of this cold case.
Construction crews were moving earth in a rural spot near Greeley when they made a horrifying discovery. They found human remains, just 15 miles southeast of Jonelle's childhood home. DNA testing confirmed what everyone feared. It was Jonelle. Forensic analysis showed a single clear bullet hole in her skull. Her family finally had the tragic truth that she had been murdered all those years ago. It brought them some closure for sure, but it screamed the biggest question of all. Who did this?
The discovery put the investigation into overdrive, leading police to ask a question that literally nobody saw coming. What does a former politician have to do with a 35-year-old cold case? Section 4. The unusual suspect, Steve Pankey, enters the frame. By September 2019, police went public with a person of interest they had been secretly eyeing. His name was Steve Pankey. He was a pretty well-known figure who had actually run for governor of Idaho in 2014 and 2018. Now, Panky's story was throwing up major red flags from day one. He claimed he didn't know the Matthews family at all, and only heard about Jonelle on the radio days later. But here's the reality. He lived just 2 miles away from their house. Oh, and he had been a youth pastor at the exact same Sunnyview Church of the Nazarene that the Matthews family went to every single week. Plus, over the decades, Panky had a super weird habit of inserting himself into the investigation, demanding immunity before he would hand over information to the police.
Section 5. A web of bizarre clues. The ex-wife's testimony. To figure out how deep this really goes, investigators talked to someone who was living with Panky back in 1984, his now ex-wife Angela Hicks, and she ended up providing some of the most damning circumstantial evidence of this entire explainer.
You have to hear these bizarre anomalies Angela remembered from right around the time Jonelle vanished. So Panky claimed they had this pre-planned family trip to California on December 21st. But Angela told police, nope, the trip actually started on the 22nd and he completely sprang it on them, unplanned. When they got back, he forced her to read newspaper articles about the missing girl. Then he starts digging in their yard, totally unprompted. And the craziest part? Later that same week, a vehicle they kept on their property mysteriously caught fire and burned to a crisp.
And that bizarre behavior seemed to manifest into outright guilt as the years went on. In 2008, Panky's own son was tragically murdered. At the funeral, Angela recalled him saying something absolutely chilling. He said, "I hope God didn't allow this to happen because of Jonelle Matthews." Now, Panky vehemently denied ever uttering those words, but Angela said she never, ever forgot them.
Section 6. The Long Road to Closure. Unraveling on Camera. As investigators turned up the heat, Panky didn't lawyer up and stay quiet. Nope, he actually went on a media tour, giving all these inflammatory interviews. The wildest one was a 51-minute sit-down with KTVB. His demeanor was shockingly flat, totally unfeeling for a guy being accused of murdering a child.
During these interviews, he was all over the place. Totally unprompted, he kept using his gay background as a defense to prove he wouldn't be interested in young girls. But then, he slipped up on camera. He literally called Jonelle's case a murder long before her body was even found. When pressed on how he knew she was dead, he spun this wild tale about his father-in-law hearing about a buried body from a cop. Ultimately, he just played the victim, claiming Greeley police were planting evidence to frame him. He was the absolute definition of an unreliable narrator.
But here's a modern twist that is just, it's a real game changer. Once his name was publicly tied to the investigation, people realized Steve Panky was an active Patreon supporter of true crime podcasts. Specifically, he was funding The Trail Went Cold, which happened to be one of the very first podcasts to do a deep dive into the unsolved disappearance of Jonelle Matthews.
So I want to leave you with this to chew on. Was Steve Panky just an average guy who had a really intense obsession with true crime? Or was he a killer, meticulously keeping tabs on his own 35-year-old cold case? In October of 2020, Panky was officially indicted on charges of first-degree murder and kidnapping. Getting justice for Jonelle was an incredibly long, painful road, but it just goes to show, no matter how many years pass by or how much snow covers the tracks, the truth has a way of coming to the surface. So, what do you make of Panky's bizarre behavior? Think about it.